include the Bay of Pigs invasion. Since the end of World War II in 1945, most Americans could agree on one thing: communism was the enemy.
In this global climate of ignorance, fear, disinformation, and presidential machismo, the Cuban Revolution emerged in 1959.
Soon after, relations between Cuba and the United States began to deteriorate. The feeling in some circles of influence was that Cuba was a threat to the U.S. and something had to be done. The counter-revolutionary forces, known as Brigade 2506, were assembled at Ratahilu, on the west coast of Guatemala. The U.S. engineers established the airport bases especially for this mission. 6 ships sailed from Nicaraguan's Puerto Cabeza on April 14th, cheered by Nicaraguan President and U.S.-friendly dictator Luis Somoza.
The Cuban government knew an invasion was coming, but could not guess exactly when or where the attack would take place. When teams of U.S. B-26 bombers began attacking 4 Cuban airfields simultaneously on Saturday, April 15th, the Cubans were prepared. Castro later testified the few planes belonging to the Cuban Air Force had been dispersed and camouflaged, some obsolete, unusable planes left out to fool the attackers and draw the bombs.
As part of the CIA cover story, the attacking B-26 planes were distinguished to look as if they were Cuban planes flown by defecting Cubans. An exiled Cuban pilot named Mario Zuniga was present to the media as a defector and photographed next to his plane. The photo was published in most of the major papers, but the surprising omission of several serious details and the overwhelming amount of information already gathered by reporters helped bring out the truth much sooner than anyone expected.
Before the operation began, CIA operatives were sent to Cuba to aid the invading forces. Their task was to blow up key bridges and perform other acts of terrorism that would make it appear as if the people of Cuba were joining the invasion. Jose Buzolto was one of those operatives. He flew straight into Havana Airport, posing as a student from Boston College coming home on vacation.
Shortly after the attack started, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Adela Stevenson, finally rejected Cuban report of this attack, telling the General Assembly that the attacking planes were from the Cuban Air Force, presenting a copy of a photograph published in the newspaper. In the photo, the plane shown as an oblique nose, whereas the model of the B-26 plane used by the Cubans had a plexan nose. Within a few hours, the truth was revealed, and Stevenson was extremely embarrassed to learn that Kennedy had referred to him as my official liar.
The landing began shortly before midnight on Sunday, April 16th, after a team of frogmen went ashore and set up landing lights to guide the operation. The invading force consisted of 1,500 men divided into 6 battalions, with Manuel Artem as the political chief.
2 battalions came ashore at Playa Grande and 1 at Playa Larrea, but the operation didn't go as smoothly as expected. The razor-sharp coral reefs, identified as seaweed by U-2 spy photos, delayed the landing enough to expose the air attacks to the following morning. 2 ships sank about 80 yards from shore, and some heavy equipment was lost.
Cuban militia commander Jose Ramon Gonzalez Succo was one of 5 men stationed in Playa Larga when the invasion began, and the first to report the invasion. On Monday, April 17th, as the invasion was well underway, U.S. Secretary of State Dean Rusk gave a press conference. The American people are entitled to know whether we are intervening in Cuba or intend to do so in the future, he said. The answer to that question is no. What happens in Cuba is for the Cuban people to decide.
Succo was never told when the invasion would begin. He was surprised to hear that the attack had started, and he didn't have time to get around to completing his assignment. Instead, he drove out to the Guantanamo and jumped the fence into the U.S. naval base.
By 3 a.m. Monday morning, Castro knew about the landing, and the Cuban government responded almost immediately, taking a superior position in the air during the early morning hours. Cuban pilot Captain Enrique Rojas was able to quickly sink the command vessel Maropa and then supply ship Houston. After Ambassador Stevenson became aware of the true facts, he was so outraged that he publicly urged Washington to stop the attack and avoid further embarrassment. Soviet Ambassador Zorin said, "Cuba is not alone today. Among her most sincere friends, the Soviet Union is to be found." The
expected supporting air coverage by the U.S. Air Force never came. In a political environment full of posturing threats and confusion, risk advised Kennedy to break off, concluding that additional strikes would tilt international opinion too far against the United States.
Prouty, the first focal point officer between the CIA and the Air Force of clandestine operation, quotes the report by General Maxwell Taylor, a member of the Kennedy-appointed Cuban Study Group. From its inception, the plan had been developed under the ground rule that it must retain a covert character, it should include no action which, if revealed, could not be plausibly denied by the United States, and should look to the world as an operation exclusively conducted by Cubans.
This ground rule meant, among other things, that the U.S. military forces or individuals could take part in combat operations. In a desperate, last-ditch effort to support the invasion, a limited airstrike was approved on April 19th, but it would not be enough. 4 American pilots lost their lives that day. Without supplies on air or air coverage, the invading forces fell. To them, the lack of air coverage was a direct betrayal. In all the end, 200 rebel soldiers were killed, and 1,197 others were captured.
On April 20th, Fidel Castro announced over Havana's radio union that the revolution has been victorious, destroying in less than 72 hours the army the U.S. imperialist government had organized for many months.
U.S. involvement in the Bay of Pigs was a direct violation in agreements, which made armed attacks illegal except in self-defense.
These are the undeniable facts. Number 1. The invasion was planned by the U.S. Number 2. The exile army was recruited, trained, paid, and supplied by the U.S. Number 3. Planes, boats, tanks, and all military equipment was supplied by the U.S. Number 4. The provisional government was assembled and funded by the U.S. And number 5. The first on the beach were American frogmen. 4 American pilots were killed in battle.
Mass trials were held for the 1,189 men captured, and each was sentenced to 30 years in prison. After 20 months of negation, most were released in charge of $53 million in food and medicine. As a result of the U.S. failure at the Bay of Pigs and the diplomatic embarrassment and ensued, President Kennedy fired longtime CIA Director Allen W. Dulles, Deputy Director Charles P. Campbell, and the one principal responsible for the operation, Deputy Director Richard Basil. Public Kennedy assumed full responsibility of the failure, but secretly blamed the CIA and ordered a full investigation of the operation. The resulting report, written by CIA Inspector General Lyman Kirkpatrick, upset the new CIA Director John McCone, so much that all but one of the 20 copies produced were destroyed, and the report stayed classified until February of 1998.
Aside from being at once a major victory for the Cuban Revolution and a major embarrassment for Kennedy and the CIA, the attack at the Bay of Pigs set the stage for the major confrontation between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, the missile crisis that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. In the meantime, perhaps as a result of the Bay of Pigs embarrassment, Kennedy's obsession with eliminating Castro grew. A plan code-named Operation Mongoose, spurred by Attorney General Robert S. Kennedy, attempted to eliminate Castro by any means necessary.
Thank you for joining us on this very special news broadcast of the Bay of Pigs.
Be sure to tune in next week.